First one, what drives a fire season? What contributes to them? How do they change across the country? The idea of a fire season may even be a little quaint nowadays. So why don't you dive into that one? Just explain what drives it to be of issue in one area at a certain time, and how are we looking at that now, especially with climate change?
Yeah, Lucian, this is a great starting point for the conversation today. Thinking about the fire season, we need to step back and just think about wildfire as a whole. And the most simple breakdown I like is what we call the fire behavior triangle. It's been around for a long time, and that's because it's super simple and quite comprehensive in how it explains wildfire. The idea is you have a triangle, so three different sides of what contribute to wildfire, one being fuels, one being weather, and one being terrain. The biggest one there is the fuels. If the fuels are not available to burn. So if they're wet, you can't sustain fire. That's the bottom line. So that's one of the biggest kickers that contributes to fire season is dry weather, lack of precipitation, or even just a dry atmosphere that can absorb moisture through evapotranspiration and other processes. The idea of a fire season seems a bit well, it's a bit niche. It's definitely more focused towards California, where we actually have, say a Mediterranean climate, and we have that classic, 4 to 6 months out of the year, we do not see precipitation. And then you have, more of your winter time pattern. Other parts of the world, or even just the US, have a very different fire season. So even in the Midwest, you could have what I call a bimodal fire season. So they tend to have their dry periods in the transition times, so in the spring and the fall. So the idea of a fire season is a little bit of not the best way to describe it, but we have come to that terminology because of how it sits in the West and in California and a lot of these very fire prone areas. To get a little bit more into a given fire season, we first need the fuels and the availability of the fuels to burn, but also the quantity of the fuels. So if you have super wet seasons, you could potentially have more growth, like what we've seen in the West the last 2 years. We've had fairly wet seasons and significant grass growth. When that does dry out and cure, you then have increased amounts of fuel that is or vegetation that's ready to burn. So it can be dichotomous where you think more precipitation is actually going to be better for the fire season. It can actually then end up hurting you when you do have something like a Mediterranean climate where you're almost guaranteed to have that dry period and those fuels will dry out. So, and in addition to that, after the fuels are ready, it comes down to the weather, at least as far as dynamic components. The terrain, it's a huge impact, but that's pretty static. So we won't really belabor that much today. So then you talk about the predominant weather features. So for a given fire season, if I'm going to talk about the West, when we particularly dry out in the early season, we tend to have what we call ridges, so heat waves, that sort of thing. And that's going to be, classic, just daily swings from evening to day with very consistent, hot, dry conditions. Lots of ignitions, lots of opportunity for fire potential, but it's not as high impact as, say, certain wind events. So the predominant weather feature is going to be also incredibly important. And when we think of the West, we often think of offshore wind events or Santa Anas, or they're also known as downslope windstorms. Those are particularly common here towards the end of the fire season, which is why then some folks tend to say out here the fire season isn't really until, August, September, October, where the whole of fire season is pretty much as defined by myself when the fuels are dry and available to burn.
Oh, very cool. And I guess just geographically to understand then, when we look at the Southeast and that area, we look even at the Northeast, do they see a change where their fuels are basically then very dry at the end of the winter? So in the springtime, that's why we hear about more wildfires occurring, in the mid-Atlantic and that, or do they have that same risk throughout the year? It's just that's when all the conditions come together for that, possible spark to occur.
Yeah, for the Northeast and even the South, the winter time can definitely be more of a fire season for them, but it's just much less consistent. So I'd
That makes
fair away
sense.
from saying that that's their fire season.
Hmm.